Okay, so this first question is sort of for everybody on the panel, and it's why did you decide to study a foreign language, and why the particular language you studied?
Okay, so I studied and speak Spanish. It was kind of a natural move. I grew up in an area with a lot of Spanish speakers, have a lot of close family friends that speak Spanish, and I grew up around it and then studied it formally and came here and was like, gotta keep going. And it really has opened up a lot of doors for me and helped me create really strong relationships here in the US and around the world. And I just can't stress enough how important it is to be bilingual. As a Spanish teacher, I drill it into my students' heads every day. Just the ability to communicate and to broaden your perspective and build bridges of empathy, really, through language and new ideas and new ways of thinking about communication.
I would say something. I grew up in an area and went to high school, especially with a lot of Spanish speakers, and grew up in a family where the language was a very important thing. And so it was not like a conscious decision I made. It was just sort of something that was like a given in what I was going to do. And the reason for Spanish is because I grew up where I did in New Haven, Connecticut, and just had a lot of exposure to Spanish speakers and also to Spanish-speaking soccer fans, and I'm a big soccer fan, and just sort of said, like, if I'm going to do this and I'm going to spend more time in Latin America, then this is clearly the language for me.
So, unlike the two of you, I grew up in Vermont, which is a delightful place, but it's a very homogenous place, and there wasn't a lot of, I wasn't hearing like lots of other languages growing up. So I think it was sort of the opposite for me. It was almost this sort of like escapism. Starting out in middle school when we were first able to take languages, was very excited and had trouble choosing. At the time you had to choose one, which I was sort of disappointed by because I really loved the idea of studying a language as sort of a vehicle to get me other places. So I ended up taking French in part because my grandmother actually, who I never really knew that well, but was a high school French teacher, and so I was sort of inspired by that, and also because Montreal was just up the road, and so particularly in high school, we spent lots of time there.
So I chose to study Korean because I was greatly influenced by the Korean wave, the pop culture and the dramas, and I grew up watching them, and so when I came to Wesleyan during Westfest, the student of color, they invited the AMITA students to come, and I remember the first class that I went into and sat in was in Professor Back's Korean class, and I remember walking down the stairs with her, and I barely knew the characters, but I was already like trying to write my name for her because I wanted to take Korean, and that was actually one of the first courses that I enrolled in at Wesleyan.
I was always obsessed with language growing up, and always grew up monolingual, which never really, but I had studied French, Spanish in school when I got to Wesleyan, and I just don't know why I chose Italian. But like many of us who speak Italian, not reasons of disability. I think it was an aesthetic choice, but I have no recollection of why or how I made that decision. But it actually ended up being useful to me. I've used it throughout the years actually to do translation, which helped me pay the bills during graduate school, and so yeah, it was really, it's been a wonderful thing. And actually, even continuing now, as a linguist and academic, I have colleagues in Italy who are studying things very similar to me, and we're establishing collaborations, and being able to speak Italian with them is actually really, really useful.
Okay, Molly.
Yeah, so like I said, my original interest and was looking at criminal feedback. And my impetus for picking had to do with literature. So I read all of the Russian grade year the first semester in English, and then thought that I was missing something. And so I thought that I would need to learn the language in order to be able to you don't understand what the writers are trying to say. And I just I dove into it. I was taking Spanish at the same time as Russian, but in all classes I was mixing things up. My brain could not handle a Spanish literature class and Russian 101. It just could not happen. So my Spanish has been replaced by Russian, unfortunately. It's interesting how languages could do that. I hope if I ever move to Spain one day, I'd be able to get back my 17 years of Spanish. But yeah, so learning Russian for me was a desire born out of literature, but in the end it really just came from a very strong interest in Russian literature. Any American I meet that lives here, a lot of them are liberal arts students who studied Russian literature and who disappeared for left. So I think they're scared of people, and it's really hard to explain why we did it, and sometimes to say like because we wanted to, like the very Zen thing. The Russian, well, the version that I picked really.
So I grew up in Southern California, and I originally had studied Spanish, so I thought I was just going to continue doing that here, but it didn't fit with my schedule, so I decided why not take Russian, because my grandparents had gone to the Soviet Union, and they described it as like this big, scary place, so naturally I wanted to learn that language, and I don't know, once I started taking it, I just loved it. It kind of retrained my brain to think in a different way about like the English language and just how I learn in general, which kind of got me hooked. And yeah, and I love Russian history. And I was always fascinated by this big, huge country that I was told from my whole childhood that it's just like a bad place. And then I went, and it's great. I mean, it's not great, but it's a big place. I liked it. It's
Great. Sorry, Austin.
I grew up in Guatemala City, Guatemala, and I grew up speaking Spanish, but I went to an American school, so switching between languages kind of had always been a part of my life. And when I came to Wesleyan, I started taking Italian because I was curious to take a language. I thought it was beautiful, and I wanted to study abroad in Italy. And as soon as I started taking it, I completely fell in love with the language and also with the process of learning a language. And that's what kind of drove me to keep taking it. And after I came back from abroad, I also took a year of Portuguese because I also wanted to take it because I thought it was a beautiful language. And I knew that learning languages was something that I wanted to continue doing throughout my life.
So I grew up in Boston. Nothing really having to do with languages there, but my mom taught, my mom became fluent in Spanish by just learning it. She was not a native speaker, she just learned it. So I grew up with kind of Spanish all around me and just could not pick up the language. I had no hope of learning Spanish ever. So I kind of got it into my head originally that I was just like not good at languages and just didn't click. And then when I got to Wesleyan, I wanted to study Japanese because I had just always had an interest in animation. If you like animation, you can't ignore Japan. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And I planned on doing my 1 year of language study so that I could go abroad and study there. And circumstantially just ended up continuing with the language. I studied abroad twice, went abroad each summer, and like just fell in love with the language itself. I'm seeing a common trend here. But it was so wonderful, especially having like grown up with this thought of like, no, I'm just never gonna learn another language, to then kind of find that break where I could find this other way of expressing myself. That was kind of the most rewarding part of it was just finding it literally a new language with which I could just like be myself still. That's how I got to Japanese.
For me, what started, I think, with a fascination in like Greek and Latin mythology in middle school somehow turned into 5 years of Latin in high school. And then when I got to college, given the Latin background, I really wanted to learn more about this peninsula that I'd learned so much about, but in a more modern way. And so, I mean, I think Italian, it's such an incredibly beautiful language, and I was fascinated with its history and culture, and so that seemed like a really natural next step for me. And so And then as I continued to take classes in Italian, I think I was pleasantly surprised to see the many intersections between my government interest, looking at different political systems and learning about important Italian figures like Machiavelli, and so that it was a very organic transition for me. In terms of Korean, I'm Korean American. My parents are immigrants from South Korea, and so I think studying Korean ended up being very important for me in college in terms of my own identity formation and understanding myself as a Korean American and as an Asian American in this country.
This 9 reasons why you should study another language is like the bit I had thought about what I might have wanted to say on this panel is like all pretty well captured here. And, I think one of the things is that I was surprised by is how much I learned about the English language through learning other languages, and particularly because I studied abroad in Argentina, but then I moved back there after, and the first job that I could find to make ends meet was teaching English, and I was so in over my head because I mean, they were just looking for native speakers, but I didn't know a thing about teaching English, and I realized that I could answer questions that I wasn't aware that I could answer about the structure of the English language because I was translating things back into Spanish, thinking about Bo's class and other classes I took about what those structures were as a way of being able to explain what to the extent that English makes any sense at all, in trying to explain it, what that sense was.
I'd also add just like infinite confidence to like, especially when you're kind of in the early years of studying your language, when you're like almost able to have a conversation but aren't quite there, kind of getting over that hump of just saying, all right, I can either not speak or I can say something and just hope it works out. And usually it does work out. So just kind of like figuring out that like if you're just confident enough to say something, even if what you're trying to say does not get across at all, it still brings you one step closer to knowing what you maybe should have said. So just kind of gaining confidence in just like saying something rather than like not being afraid to use the language for fear of messing up.
For me, I think it's been really fascinating to see how how this Romance language background and then also this Eastern language background that I have has been able to translate into being able to communicate in other languages that I don't necessarily speak. So at one point I was working at a dry cleaners in Oakland, and the folks that I was working with, it was actually it was Korean owned. And so it was because of the Korean background and the fact that I could speak English, I was hired for that position. And then some of the other employees there were Spanish speakers with limited English speaking ability. So I would speak to them in Italian, they would speak to me in Spanish, and we were able to communicate. It was actually really quite wonderful, thinking back on that experience. And then thinking with my Korean background, with all of the recruitment that I do in East Asia and Southeast Asia, the Korean pronunciation is I'm able to translate into when I look at Japanese words, and if it's written in English, the way that I pronounce certain words is in my accent is able to be understood much more easily by Japanese speakers. Or I might be talking to families in China, and there's certain words that they're saying that I can connect that Chinese word with Korean because of the way Sino-Korean is a part of the Korean language as well. So it's really been fascinating to be able to communicate with other people speaking other languages through the languages that I have as my foundation.
For me, it was kind of how language informs culture. So I kind of had this whole hypothesis that there's so many Russian hackers because of the way that the Russian language is grammatically structured. And I went down the rabbit hole with that. Has to do with their education system too. But I don't know, that may not be true, but I think that language does inform a lot about the culture of a country, and I think learning that is invaluable.
Yeah, I want to say that I'm in a position where, I've kind of switched out my main language. I don't speak English It's actually such a relief to be able to sit with you guys right now.
You're doing great.
That I spent the first 20 years of my life speaking, and now, like I said, I speak, once a week. So that makes my English at times rather mangled, and it puts my order out of the way, because as Austin knows, question sentence can really be in any order you want. The verb can go at the beginning, the end, and also there's no articles. It's just a completely different way of living. And so I find that my English in text and then when I speak, I can appreciate it in an entirely new way. First of all, how difficult the English language actually is. And second of all, how limited it is, not to insult the English language, but I really feel like, what Austin said about the hackers is definitely true. I have a fair amount of, hacker culture is real here. But on the other hand, express yourself in Russian in just these beautiful ways. My favorite verb that maybe Austin will know is хочется. In English, it means to want, but it is that your body wants it, not you. So instead of saying I'm hungry, I am hungry, I want to eat, your body says now I suddenly feel like eating. In English, I just have to explain that, but it just really makes me appreciate the way of human expression, I guess I'd say.
This is sort of seconding the confidence point. I think for me that one of the most important pieces of learning a second language was the sort of immersive part, or in this case, my study abroad experiences. I was extraordinarily shy when, around the time that I came to Wesleyan, and I actually was lucky enough to study abroad in high school, and that had been probably one of the most important things that I've ever done in terms of changing the direction of my life and sort of my ability to be in the world as a comfortable person. And then studying abroad in Paris helped with that a lot, and then I had spent some more time living abroad afterwards. But I think being sort of forced to interact in the way that was described earlier, and learning that it's okay, that nothing terrible will happen if you make a mistake, was really, really huge for me. And so I mentioned I worked in the cheese industry for a little while, and a big part of what for about 2 years, I was doing sales, which is not something that I ever would have imagined wanting to do or enjoying. But I actually really think that my experiences learning languages and being sort of forced to speak when I was not comfortable were really important in allowing me to do that work and allowing me to be successful in that work. Because I think there are similar skills in terms of just being able to connect with someone very different from you very quickly, and sort of get a sense for where they're coming from and communicate sort of by the seat of your pants often as effectively as possible.
Yeah, echoing that point, with the confidence, I had so many Russian faux pas that now I'm just kind of shameless in a lot of things that I do. And just kind of fearlessness and a willingness to say I don't get something in the professional world is actually really beneficial, because you don't come off as a know-it-all. You're just asking questions that can help you do your job better, instead of pretending you know how to do everything and then not doing it well. So I don't know, kind of that willingness to ask questions if you don't understand something, and being okay with not knowing it all has helped me professionally, if that makes sense.
I think professionally also just, they'll say it over and over again, but I'll hammer it home that just knowing another language can help you in so many different professional contexts. I don't think that I would be able to have got the position that I currently do without the language skill, because so much of my particular position is interacting with different filmmakers and being a point for them to be able to come to and to be able to actually speak their language and actually have that real dialogue, rather than being just a point of contact for something, but actually being a point at which somebody can tell you what's actually going on through kind of a larger working relationship is so important.
Yeah, I think when I was working as an interpreter, I was only able to do that because I had studied this language and lived in this language enough to get to that level and do some training. And then by virtue of that, I mean, I was not a natural science person at all, never really thought I would find myself in a hospital, and I wound up working for 3 years, working directly with patients who I considered to be my patients as much as they were the clinical provider's patients, and I just saw things that I absolutely never imagined that I would have. I mean, I don't have any children, but I've seen like 100 kids born. So that was really great. And I guess one other thing I'd say is that in addition to learning another language, helping to generate confidence in yourself, it also, so this is number 5 in your guide. This point about learning a language and feeling a sense of vulnerability as a way of identifying with people who are in very, very different life circumstances from your own, which is something that I do on a daily basis, working with immigrant communities, is like even more important than learning the language itself. It's because it's not just a function of language, it's a function of people living lives, interacting with one another, understanding what causes people to decide not to interact with institutions and social structures, and it's just like this massive, massive thing that, particularly if you come from a position of great privilege like I do, and I think like a lot of us in this room do, it's one of the best ways to understand just a tiny little bit about what it's like to not have that all of a sudden, because you lose your ability to communicate in the way that you want to, and then you then have to take it a step beyond it and kind of extrapolate to what that would mean if you're trying to access a healthcare system that you're not familiar with, you're trying to find work in a place that you're not familiar with, and all of these things that are totally threaded through the lives of hundreds and hundreds of millions or billions of people around the world.
This is similar to some things that have already been said, and I definitely agree about the confidence and the willing to make mistakes thing. But I think also learning another language just teaches you how to get to know people in a different way. Because when you're speaking to native speakers of a language you're learning, for example, you end up learning about differences in your culture and theirs, and kind of like different ways they even phrase things. That can teach you a lot about a culture. And when you think about these things that you wouldn't have necessarily thought about before, then you can apply that to meeting people back home or that you knew already, and it kind of opens your mind to different experiences and different things you wouldn't necessarily be aware of.
If I could jump in first. I think there's really great points, and I think it makes me think about how humbling it is to be learning a language and to realize how much you don't know. And I think it does give you great empathy for other people who are trying to learn, say, English or something like that. But it's also made me see much more about communication and how much communication breaks down all the time, and how much we overestimate about what people understand. And I think that only when you've been in that position of realizing, I don't understand, I need more, I need someone to talk more slowly, more simply, that you're able to see all of the ways that, say, native speakers just can talk very quickly, total shorthand, all these they can connect. So I think it does help generally with empathy and more specifically with communication in general.
I think another piece is that it's constantly evolving. You're always a learner. You never really reach an end point in learning another language, even if you're a native speaker. There's different dialects of English in the UK versus here, and as a learner of Spanish, I will always be a learner of Spanish. I talk to people from different parts of the world, and I learn how they speak it there, or their regional dialect. And I think as a liberal arts grad, we're all learning, and language is a great way to